Welcome to another online Cardiff Book Talk. So I'm delighted today to chair this special event on Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory. I'm Anna Mercer and I'm a lecturer in English literature at Cardiff University and I'm coordinating Cardiff Book Talk. This event holds a special interest for me because one of the authors I discovered during one of the lockdown periods was Graham Greene. I have devoured his fiction recently and I hope this event might lead you to do the same. I was unsure of which novel to dedicate a book talk to. Maybe it should have been the violent and gripping Brighton Rock, the tense relationships and political intrigue of The Quiet American, or the romantic tragedy of The End of the Affair. But something that unites The Power of Greene for me is his beguiling, disarming protagonists, often haunted by themselves as much as their situation. For that reason, The Power and the Glory, the tale of a whiskey priest on the run in 1930s Mexico, remained with me. It was the most surprising to me as a novel, a rewarding read that I couldn't put down, and also an intensely moving and vivid work, worthy, I think, of the title of Greene's masterpiece. The Power and the Glory provides a powerful comment on humanity, encouraging us to reflect on compassion, sin, and destiny in the spiritual, physical, and emotional struggles of the main character. Joining me tonight are three experts on Graham Greene, who will discuss the novel in 3 short talks, and then we will open the floor to an audience Q&A. They will cover topics such as Greene as an author, his experiences in Mexico, faith and Catholicism, Greek tragedy, the novel form, the human condition, sainthood, and I think much more. So we have a lot to get through, and I'm going to pass over now to our first speaker for the evening, Jon Wise. Jon Wise has had a lifelong interest in Greene and his writings. He has co-authored and published a 2-volume bibliographic guide to the works of the writer, and a third is currently being prepared for publication by Bloomsbury. He has lectured on Greene and also appeared on local and national radio. He is a Graham Greene Birthplace trustee and manages the trust's website. Jon is an ex-secondary school teacher and is now retired. He holds a doctorate in naval history from the University of Exeter and has published extensively on the subject. His talk today is entitled, "Why Did Graham Greene Write The Power and the Glory? A Bibliographer's Perspective." And so over to you, Jon.
Oh, thank you very much, Anna, for that introduction. Good evening, everybody. Greene wrote on 4 separate occasions about how he came to write The Power and the Glory. But for some time, it proved to be quite elusive on the matter of why he wrote it. And at this particular stage in his career. Nevertheless, one is able to piece together something of the background to his writing, of what became, as Anna alluded to, probably his most famous novel.
Hi, Jon. I think you just need to put your slides in presentation mode.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, will do.
Then that's
okay.
Perfect.
There we are.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, this I intend to piece together some of the background to this writing, and then to suggest that there are clues at the very end that point to a personal statement by the writer about his faith, which has not, to my knowledge, been remarked on hitherto. There are many contradictions in Greene's life and personality. He professed to be a very private person, and yet he gave over 80 published interviews during his lifetime. This included a book-length series of interviews with the journalist Marie-Françoise Hélène called The Other Man. His religious views were said to be quite sacrosanct, and yet The Other Man contains an entire chapter devoted to that topic. Greene first recounted the writing of The Power and the Glory in an introduction to a collected edition of his novels, which were published separately in German and in French in the early 1960s. Only 2 of the introductions were subsequently published in English, but fortunately one was The Power and the Glory, and this was dated June 1962. Following January, one of his articles appeared in Books and Bookman journal called An Unhappy Journey, How I Wrote The Power and the Glory. The French and German introduction and this article are identical. In each case, Greene writes about his experience in Mexico with a journalistically objective detachment, as in this quotation. About a decade later, the UK collected edition of Greene's novels were published over a 12-year period, complete with introductions. Archival research that I've undertaken into the manuscripts he used to prepare these for publication show that Greene, with 1 or 2 exceptions, used the same introductions he'd used a decade earlier. Clearly never a wasted word. The same applied to what he wrote about the power and the glory in the 2nd volume of his autobiography called Ways of Escape, published in 1980. What is missing and up until then was any disclosure which pointed to an emotional dimension to his journey through Mexico, which will confirm his commitment to Catholicism, which he had hitherto described as an intellectually based belief. For this, one has to look in the introduction to the novel that preceded it, Brighton Rock, in order to find evidence. It's pertinent that Greene notes here that he was correcting the proofs of Brighton Rock while in Mexico, and one deduces that in the period 1935 to 1938, the author was arriving at a point where he was ready to use religious themes, and that Mexico provided the tipping point. When he was writing Brighton Rock, he states, quote, "It is true to say that by 1937, the time was ripe for me to use Catholic characters. There's a religious awareness too in A Gun for Sale, published in 1936, 2 years before Brighton Rock. We share on Anne Crowder's thoughts at one point, quote, she believed in fate and God, vice and virtue, Christ in the stable, all the Christmas stuff. A religious awareness, but not a character. This was come, of course, with Pinky and Rose in Brighton Rock." Greene claimed on more than one occasion he didn't go to Mexico with the intention of writing a novel, but his experiences there gave him the emotional dimension he had lacked hitherto. Amidst all this speculation, one mustn't forget that Greene at the time had a wife and 2 children under 5 to support. He was not even certain that his future lay in writing fiction. An interesting letter from Greene's agent, Nancy Pern, to his wife, Vivian Greene, is revealing on this matter. The background to Greene's visit to Mexico is that in 1936, the Catholic publisher Frank Sheed had the idea of asking Greene to go to Mexico to write about religious persecution. The trouble was that the worst of it was over by the late 1930s, except in one state, Tabasco, where all the churches were shut and no priest was permitted to practice. So the plan languished and then dropped. Greene turned to his usual publisher, Heinemann, but they weren't interested either. And so he decided to approach Longmans Greene and the Catholic branch of that publisher, Burns Oates, because he knew Tom Burns personally. There was another dimension. As well as needing work, there was his perennial problem with boredom. Greene arrived in Mexico in early 1938. The result, was his travel book entitled The Lawless Roads, about his experiences, and this was published the following year, 1939. In the last part of my talk, I want to hypothesize that the power and the glory includes a very personal expression of faith, in addition to the accepted interpretation of the book being part of the sequence of Greene's so-called Catholic novels, Brighton Rock, The Power and the Glory, The Heart of the Matter, and The End of the Affair, which collectively explore the theme of, quote, the appalling strangeness of the mercy of God, which is the notable quotation which comes right at the end of Brighton Rock. In the prologue to The Lawless Roads, Greene recalls his teenage self, aged 13, standing alone at night in the garden of his school with the sound of Mendelssohn being played in the distance. And this is almost, for Greene, uncharacteristically eloquent, that particular quotation, I think. There are parallels between the characterization of Louis and the youthful Greene. Louis in the novel is 14 and is described as bored, restless, irritated by his mother's pious retelling of the martyrdom of Father Miguel Pro to Louis and his younger sisters, just as Greene describes being bored by the routines of his Church of England upbringing. Louis is fascinated by the presence in his town of the lieutenant with a gun in its holster at his hip. Here is something real and tangible as opposed to the stories told by his mother, where the only part which excites him is a description of the actual death of the martyr. The novel ends with him on the night of the priest, after the priest's execution. The narrative alternates between Louis and the lieutenant walking home, mentally justifying his actions. Louis rejects what the lieutenant represents by spitting on his revolver. This is perhaps mindful of the story of the blind Bartimaeus in Mark's Gospel, whose eyes are opened as Christ speaks to him. It seems that Louis's eyes are opened by the presence of an actual martyr of the church in their midst, and the promise of his mother of obtaining a blood-stained relic, tangible evidence. There are echoes too of what Greene wrote about being able, even as a child, to distinguish between the man and his office, the drunken, disgraced priest on the one hand, and his martyrdom on the other. The author's adoption of the disciple doubting Thomas as his baptismal name is apposite at this point. His first-hand experience of a living faith among the peoples of the Chiapas Mountains seems to have had a profound effect on the skeptical mind of the writer. The usual interpretation of the last page of the novel, with a knock on the door in the middle of the night and the arrival of the new priest, is of a continuum in the life of the church, bolstered by the prayers of the faithful. But the boy Louis is there too, and symbolically it's he who opens the door. Perhaps Greene did indeed go to Mexico in the hope of finding the emotional dimension missing from his faith. And this is what links what he remembered as a 13-year-old in The Lawless Roads, about how faith came to one shapelessly without dogma, with his own experience seen through the eyes of the teenage Louis. For many years, Greene considered The Power and the Glory to be his best book, written, as he said, to a thesis. However, in 1964, he qualified this judgment in a loosely ordered journal diary he was keeping at the time. A doctored part of that diary was eventually published in a magazine some 20 years later, in which he stated that he no longer thought that the novel was his best work.
Thank you so much, Jon. Thank you for starting our discussion this evening with a really fascinating talk that had so much in it about Greene's process as a writer, which I found really, really interesting. Thank you. Let's move on to our second speaker and save questions for the end, but reminding the audience that you can use the Q&A box from now to put your questions in there, and we will put them to Jon and the panel. Our second speaker tonight is Yuliya Kazanova. Yuliya holds a PhD in English from the University of Leeds. She taught at the University of Leeds and now works at the European Languages and Cultures Department in the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Her research interests include 20th century English fiction and contemporary Ukrainian literature. She is a chartered linguist and has translated into Ukrainian The Culture of Spontaneity, Improvisation and the Arts in Post-War America by Daniel Belgrad. Her thesis on Graham Greene won the Leeds Early Career Publishing Prize, and she is now working on publishing it as an open access monograph with White Rose University Press, that plan is. Her talk today is entitled Anatomy of a Greeneian Novel, The Power and the Glory. So over to you, Yuliya.
Thank you, Anna. And in the next 10 minutes, I would like to discuss how The Power and the Glory and other typical Greeneian novels work in terms of genre from the standpoint of aesthetic criticism and specifically Northrop Frye's theory of modes. The Power and Glory was published on the 4th of March, 1940, and it basically established Greene's reputation as a Catholic novelist. The Power and Glory is the second of 4 novels written between 1938 and 1951 that are often seen as the so-called Catholic cycle, which Jon mentioned. Greene was known as a Catholic writer, and this was a title that he disliked, and instead he called himself a writer who happened to be a Catholic. And in a later interview, Greene agreed that these 4 novels indeed form a single thematic cycle, but he deliberately avoided explicit references to Catholicism and instead said that these novels are devoted to the appalling strangeness of the mercy of God. David Lodge rightly said that for Greene, Catholicism was less than a system of belief, but rather a reservoir of symbols, which he could order and dramatize some intuitions about the nature of human conditions, which he gained prior to his adoption of Catholic faith. I would like to argue that he adopted a similar approach to the genre of Catholic novel, and he appropriated the elements that helped him to articulate his perception of faith. According to Mark Bosco and David Lodge, the major elements which Greene used are the idea of sinner being at the heart of Christianity and the idea of mystical substitution. These 2 elements are informed by the heroic legend of the French poet and essayist Charles Péguy, the defender of the damned against the reproductions of God, which Greene somewhat selectively forged for himself. And the whiskey priest in The Power and Glory is a vivid example of such a sane sinner. He accuses himself of multiple sins: pride, lust, despair. He also sired an illegitimate daughter and broke his vow. However, the awareness of sins paradoxically brings him closer to God. And this paradox is apparent in the prison scene, when the priest spends a night in the overcrowded cell in total darkness. And it is this experience, paradoxically, which teaches him that there is beauty in suffering, that there is some hope in despair, and that even in a fallen world, one can find grace, and that there is hope even for such a sinner as himself. And only once he has descended into this human hell in miniature can he begin his ascent, which brings in the hagiographic plot devoted to the ascension of an individual to faith. And in a typical Greeneian mirroring technique, the priest's upward journey to faith is mirrored in the fable-like story of Juan the Martyr, which mother reads to her children, which Jon also mentioned. In Northrop Frye's terms, this plot would belong to the romantic mode. But this romantic plot is brought into the predominantly tragic mode. And here is where the influence of the Greek tragedy dominates. Greene himself said that he saw the power and glory essentially as a 17th century tragedy in which actors symbolize a vice or virtue. This comment obviously suggests a strong presence of the tragic mode in the novel. And I would like to suggest that it is manifested via the figure of the tragic hero and scapegoat character. Greene's originality, I think, lies in the way how he combines all these elements in the image of the protagonist, the whiskey priest. At first sight, he seems an anti-hero, a scapegoat character, Pharmacos, who belongs to the ironic mode, because the reader looks down on his fumbled attempts to escape capture, his drinking, his neglect of himself, and his vacation. He does not have a high status, which is conventionally associated with tragic heroes. And in fact, it is the lieutenant, his adversary, who resembles the tragic hero, because he is like the figure of authority, like Sophocles and Creonte, whose hubris brings about mass death and destruction. But in theological terms, the priestly vocation confers onto the whiskey priest this spatial status. And this particular relationship with God makes him equivalent to the tragic heroes who act as mediators between ordinary man and a superior force like God or fate. Moreover, it can be argued that an individual who lives in a godless universe and attempts to embrace faith, undertakes a heroic endeavor. And this attempt itself is a measure of his heroism. And moreover, the whiskey priest also acquires a heroic stature when, like Sophocles and Oedipus, he accepts full responsibility for his actions, irrespective of his initial subjective intentions. In other words, he accepts total responsibility and blame for the guilty society. And this echoes the motive of voluntary damnation, which Greene took from Charlotte Pegue's ideas. This heroic culpability is typical for a Greek tragedy, but it is enacted in the so-called mystical substitution, which is characteristic for a Catholic novel. Mystical substitution evokes the self-sacrifice of Christ, and in the novel it involves the readiness of the protagonist. In Catholic novels, it is either the protagonist or their double, like Rose in Brighton Rock, to suffer and give up their own chance of salvation if this might save their loved ones from suffering and damnation. The whiskey priest, like Jesus Christ, takes the sins of the humanity upon himself, and he's ready to be damned, as he says to the lieutenant, if any person in this state is damned too. And more specifically, he is willing to give away his soul for the salvation of his illegitimate daughter, Brigitta. And it is this decision that makes up his tragic error, Hamartia. Characteristically, in Greenean world, this tragic error is called by a childlike female figure that corresponds to another stock character from tragedy, the suppliant. In Power and Glory, this is the child Brigitta. In The Heart of the Matter, it's Helen Rolt. In Brighton Rock, it's Rose. In A Burnt Out Case, it's Mary Ricker. A tragic mistake in Greene's interpretation is quite eclectic because it combines metaphysical guilt, intentional error, and most significantly, a self-destructive virtue. I would like to suggest that Greene characters can be viewed within Cedric Whitman's framework of heroic humanism, according to which the primary reason for the hero's downfall and death is not his hamartia, which is understood as intentional or unintentional error, and it is not a fatal weakness, but it is his fundamental virtue, the arete. For example, Ajax's pride, Antigone's perseverance, or Oedipus's sagacity. And the heroes in the Whitman's framework must affirm this virtue even at the cost of self-destruction. So if we look at Power and Glory from this angle, we can see that the arete of the whiskey priest and other protagonists of the Catholic cycle is paradoxically their fate, which elevates them to the position of tragic heroes and brings about their death at the same time. In the ending of Catholic novels, this tragic fall is balanced by the theological ascension of the protagonist. So what results is the ironic tension between the romantic and tragic modes in the plot and the protagonist, which can also be seen as tension between Christian romanticism and the starkness of Greek tragedy. This enables Greene to articulate his paradoxical view of religious faith and human condition. And this ontological vision corresponds to what Hansen termed the discourse of tragic lucidity in Eurocentric humanism, within which the human condition is perceived as tragic and expressed through the analogy with Greek tragedy. It is also this tragic vision which connects Greene to the preceding literary and philosophical tradition and such figures as Albert Camus, Miguel de Unamuno, Søren Kierkegaard. But this topic deserves a longer conversation, so I will stop here and pass the floor to Martyn.
Thank you so much, Yuliya. Virtual round of applause for you as well. Fascinating, thinking about Greene and his vision. So many thoughts. But let's move on to our final speaker for the evening, who is Martyn Sampson. So Martyn took his PhD on Graham Greene in the Department of English and at the University of the West of England, so not far from us. Where he also taught. He directed the 2018 and 2019 Graham Greene International Festivals and has just published with Fordham University Press his book, Between Form and Faith, Graham Greene and the Catholic Novel. His talk today is entitled Saints and Sainthood in Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory. Over to you, Martyn.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. Can you hear and see everything that you should? Great. Excellent. Well, thank you, Jon and Yuliya, for your insightful talks. The religion in this novel is, of course, ever present and takes many and various forms. And I'd like to focus on saints and sainthood in the novel in a way that might seem a bit different or alternative. And before I get underway, I would like to use some literary theory to angle our discussion. And the theory I wish to use is that of the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, whose thought was pretty dominant for about 40 years in English criticism and is still found in many critical texts. He's either quoted or his tools are used. One of the key terms Derrida used in his philosophy was difference. So deconstruction sought to get underneath the surface of texts and to identify not just what made them individual and unique and distinguishable as literary texts, that is their differences and difference, but also how we arrive at meanings of text through a complex series of negotiations that are always shared and sometimes in conflict with one another and sometimes competing. And this is such that the meaning of a text is deferred on an ongoing basis, sometimes perpetually, but in so doing, the meaning of the text becomes relevant now and into the future. And for Derrida, this was absolutely key because it made for a negotiation of meaning that had relevance and resonance widely. So, in regards to saints and sainthood in the novel, there are many models of sainthood. A saint isn't just someone who's canonized in the Catholic Church and, has performed a number of miracles and has been proven to have led a devout life. A saint, we might all know saints. We probably come across them daily in our lives. We may even be friends with them. There are different models of sainthood. An evangelical Christian model of sainthood may lay emphasis on how faith is interpreted through a independent sense of what the Bible is or what our given religious tradition is. Catholic general model of sainthood may look at the idea of mystery and how a believer keeps in step with a series of traditions that have been handed down over time in the Catholic Church. I'd like to look at a universal model of sainthood, which is found in Mentoring for Spiritual Growth, Sharing the Journey of Faith by Tony Horsfall, who identifies both differences in how we become or aspire towards holiness, and also how that is an ongoing interaction. he identifies 6 stages in this model of sainthood. One is the innocent, in which faith is interpreted through childhood without any personal inner structure through the church, family, school, wherever it might be. Next is the literalist, for whom faith is built around a series of rules and regulations that are identified in a fairly embryonic way. And there is a strong literalist interpretation of scripture. About 20% of adults will stay at that stage, according to Tony Horsfall, and that's okay. The loyalist is the most common stage, and it concerns conformism to a particular series of beliefs, whereby beliefs are deeply held but not critically examined. The critic is someone who has reflected on a given series of beliefs in such a way as to form an independent position. The seer is someone for whom there is not one position on faith or religion or truth, whichever is significant to a version of religion. There is a certain openness to mystery. And lastly, the saint is someone for whom God, however God is conceived, is integrated in the whole of life, and the self is removed from focus. So how to apply that to the power and the glory? Firstly, I'd like to draw your attention to the cover of the Penguin Classics edition of my version of this novel. There are a series, I think there's about 4 crosses there led against each other. One seems in the ground. Now, the front cross seems slightly informal. There seems to be a road sign against another cross, and which is indicative of how a given version of religion, an interpretation of faith Catholicism in this instance, can be socially and culturally appropriated according to the political or social movements of a nation. And of course, we've heard from Jon some of the complex politics of the Mexican state that Greene explored as he was writing this novel. Okay, so I'd like to go through each stage through some of the features of the novel. Firstly, the innocent. I think the innocent is seen in Coral Fellows. Coral Fellows is a young Catholic girl. She is the daughter of Captain Fellows, and she hides the priest in a barn as he is running away from the Mexican police, who are intent on finding him in order to capture and execute him. Captain Fellows is naturally very nervous of this, because if they are caught, they too will encounter a terrible fate. So Captain Fellows was touched with fear. He was aware of an inordinate love which robbed him of authority. You cannot control what you love. You watch it driving recklessly towards the broken bridge, the torn-up track, the horror of 70 years. She was independent of both of them. They belonged together in the past. In 40 years' time, they would be dead as last year's dog. So there is a sense here in which Coral Fellows is both slightly reckless as a child and beyond the control of Captain Fellows, and indeed also the lieutenant who has just visited them. But there's also a sense here in which she is an aspiring critic, according to the model of sainthood that we just considered. So the versions of the stages slip into each other in different ways and become resonant at different times. I think the literalist might be seen in the Judas figure, the mestizo, who dogs the priest throughout the novel. He's referred to as a half-caste in the novel, which is a reflection of the time in which the novel was written. And he tries to manipulate the priest into confessing that he is a priest in order to then give the priest up to the police. There's a certain amount of gamesmanship that goes on between them. And it's quite clear that the mestizo knows very well Catholic beliefs. He almost certainly is a Catholic, because he has a certain intimacy with its language, and he appears to try to manipulate the priest. So he says to the priest, "You needn't be afraid of me. I'm a good Christian. You're wrong. I could easily find out, couldn't I?" The half-caste said. "I just have to say, Father, hear my confession. You couldn't refuse a man in mortal sin." The priest said nothing, waiting for the demand to come. The hand which held the papers twitched. Now, it's worth pointing out here that this novel is at a particular stage in Greene's development as a writer of Catholic themes and ideas. in 1962 to 5, so moving 25 years on, there was the Second Vatican Council, which revised how the Catholic Church presented itself in the modern world. There was a sense in which the church was open to many ways of doing religion, many faiths were affirmed, and other features like the Latin Mass were less common, as Mass was given in the vernacular in many countries. So although the Mestizo has a particular dogmatic line, it is worth emphasizing that this is very much a point in Greene's career when the dogmatic line was quite common, which is maybe why the priest responds in a rather reactive way. Okay, I think the loyalist is seen in the Mexican people. So the priest finds himself in jail at a couple of points in the novel. And at one point, he is found with alcohol. He is not detected by the Mexican police for being a priest, but nevertheless, the people in the jail identify him as a priest because of the way he talks, of the way he acts, not necessarily through anything confessional that he may say. And there is a woman there who says to him, when he does more or less disclose his identity, "It is so stupid to tell them that. You don't know the sort of wretches who are here, Father, thieves, murderers." "Well," an angry voice said, which is another person, not the priest, "why are you here?" "I had good books in my house," she announced with unbearable pride. He had done nothing to shake her complacency. So what I would like to point out here is there is a sense in which the priest is trying to identify within this woman the kind of beliefs she may hold and how they are to a degree limiting. He is in a sense trying to pull her up the ladder of saintliness and shake her complacency and the pride she has because of her possessions. I think the critic is seen in the lieutenant. The lieutenant and the priest encounter each other at the end when the priest is caught, and they have a serious conversation about one another's different beliefs. This is in part where the thesis comes in which the lieutenant is dogmatically committed to his secular beliefs and the priest similarly so to his Catholic beliefs. And we are told they lay for a while in the hut. The priest thought the lieutenant was asleep until he spoke again. "You never talk straight. You say one thing to me, but to another man or a woman, you say God is love. But you think that stuff won't go down with me. So you say different things you think I'll agree with." There are a series of critical interactions going here. The critic, of course, is someone who has formed an independent position. And the two dogged believers go head to head here. And the lieutenant appears to quote 1 John in saying God is love, which could also be derived from common language about what talk of God. But notice that the lieutenant uses a quotation, so he doesn't seem to commit himself to a given version of God. Whenever we use the word God, I think we always have a certain ideological position or frame of mind in that regard. God is not used innocently frequently, even though it's part of our conversation and is deeply rooted in our culture, which is one of the reasons why the word is not necessarily reflected upon. But the word is questioned through the next feature of the text I'd like to consider, which is the omniscient narrator. I think the omniscient narrator is, to a degree, a character in the novel, insofar as the events of the novel take place in a way that is quite separate from the narrator's commentary. John pointed towards the last scene, or described the last scene in the novel when a priest reveals himself after the whiskey priest has died, suggesting that Catholicism will go on, religion will go on. There's a sense in which this novel is in part a fable. And when the priest is in jail at the end or in capture and is about to be executed, he reflects quite intently on his religion, and the narrator gets inside of his head and recounts his dream. Now, dream states are normally the preserve of modernist literature, which was a literary movement common at the start of the 20th century. It lasted about 30 years or so at least, and signified a rupture from conventional means of narration, characterization, representation, and so on, in order to raise serious questions about what art can and should do, including literature. This is not a modernist novel. Indeed, Greene seemed to turn his back on the modernist novel from England Made Me onwards, which was set in Sweden and concerned an industrialist and used various modernist techniques. And indeed, Greene, throughout his career, seems to turn his back more and more on a art for art's sake doctrine. In this instance, we see the priest dream, and we are told he had a curious dream. He dreamed he was sitting at a cafe table in front of the high altar of the cathedral. About 6 dishes were spread before him, and he was eating hungrily. At last, the 6 plates were empty. Someone out of sight rang the Sanctus bell, and the serving priest knelt before he raised the host. But he just sat on, just waiting, paying no attention to the God over the altar, as though that were a God for other people and not for him. So there's several features here I'd like to draw your attention to. First is the italicized word he. The priest is very much the center of this scene for obvious reasons, which is that it's a rather intimate dream. But equally, the priest is reflecting quite carefully at this point on where he is, to a degree subconsciously, which draws attention all the more to his ideals and what has worked for him in his journey of faith and what hasn't. And notice how the words God are qualified by the narrator. The narrator talks about the God and a God. So the narrator seems to take a rather dispassionate, disinterested tone at this moment, suggesting to a degree that the narrator is seeking to see other possibilities in this priest's journey through Mexico and the endpoint that he has reached. Okay, and lastly, the saint. For obvious reasons, I think the saint is seen in the Whiskey Priest, who is the core representative of the glory of this novel. So the priest faces his fate quite doggedly and head on at the end, when he will be executed. And he reflects on where he has come. He felt only an immense disappointment because he had to go to God empty-handed with nothing done at all. It seemed to him at that moment that it would have been quite easy to have been a saint. It would have needed only a little self-restraint and a little courage. He felt like someone who has missed happiness by seconds at an appointed place. He knew now that at the end there was only one thing that counted: to be a saint. So the saint is someone for whom God is integrated in the whole of life and where self is removed from focus. The priest knows he has been a selfish character at different points in his life. He has fathered an illegitimate child, which is, of course, against his vocation. He is obviously an alcoholic. And he, in the course of the novel, he tries to charge some of the Mexican people reasonable money to hear their confession. But equally, he knows that at the end of his journey, there is one thing left, and that is to face head on what he has sought to be loyal to throughout all of his life, which is his Catholic faith. Okay, so I'd like to conclude with some words by Paul Lakeland, who wrote The Wounded Angel Fiction and the Religious Imagination. Lakeland is a very good critic of literature and theology, and in part because he allows space for many different voices to be heard in the course of his writing. Lakeland uses the work of Wolfgang Iser, who was a reader reception theorist, a contemporary of Derrida. They both taught at the University of California, Irvine, a home of deconstruction, really. And Lakeland, so I should say reader reception theory is the idea that our expectations of text are continually challenged as we work our way through texts and as our horizons of expectation change on the basis of significant moments and changes in tone, in scene, all of the techniques that a literary text will use. Lakeland writes that the quest for holiness, the wish to be a saint, is one language for the more universal desire for integrity, and the fulfillment of this desire can be accomplished only in the context of community, or if you will, communion. So community is something we all share, obviously, along with human emotions such as desire and needs and aspirations like integrity. Lakeland is writing on this novel at this moment in suggesting that the saint is significant because of these general terms. But notice that community and communion are conflated here. That there is a strong sense in which we can all enjoy communion. It's not just a feature of the Catholic Eucharist. It's also a core feature of any experience of enjoying company, perhaps in the context of reading and discussing novels. Lakeland concludes, inappropriate in the story to a degree, we personalise it, we make it our own. We bring to this novel whatever value we see as significant. And one of the skills that Greene uses so well is that you do not have to be Catholic or religious to get lots out of this text. It speaks so powerfully into so many lives in different ways. Okay, thank you for your attention and for listening to that. If you wish to check out my book, you are welcome to. It's called Between Form and Faith, Graham Greene and the Catholic Novel by Fordham. And I explore Catholic novels and the idea of what a Catholic novel is. There is a discount code there if you wish to jot that down quickly. Thank you for your time. I'm sorry I've run over by a few minutes.
I'll just give our audience some time to maybe think of their questions. Remember, you can put those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or you can put them in the chat, either, whatever's easiest for you. So as we wait for some audience questions, I think I would like to start with a question for the whole panel. Three such great talks, there's so much to ask, and I have some specific questions as well. But as a general question to all of you, I'm really interested in the idea of anti-heroes and kind of dystopias. And I wanted to ask, do you think that Greene designed his protagonist in The Power and the Glory to raise conflicting feelings in the reader? Do you think he is an anti-hero? I know Yuliya was talking specifically about this, saying that the whiskey priest is, but then he develops into something else, something more complex. So as a starting question, I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, and also maybe potentially how that might link to other protagonists in Greene's overall canon. Jon, let's come to you first.
Well, yeah, I was very interested in what when listening to Yuliya's talk, and it struck me listening to it that I hadn't a thought that hadn't really come to me before, though it sounds obvious, that in those so-called 4 big Catholic novels that he wrote, that there's some pretty, the central protagonists are either pathetic or, and I'm thinking there of Scobie in Heart of the Matter, or a pretty nasty individual, which I think is Bendrix in The End of the Affair, and Brighton Rock with Pinky as well, who's through all of the novel is really unpleasant character. And of course, the priest, and was particularly focusing on the priest. And it really struck me that there's not very much likable about him. I mean, you know, rereading that quotation that Martyn had up at the end of towards the end of his talk, where he comes to this realization the only important thing is in life is to be a saint and look towards sainthood. Yeah, it's okay, but everything that has gone before has been pretty distasteful. There's nothing. I don't think he doesn't come across as pathetic. He just comes across as a very, very weak character. So yes, and I mean, you can look at other characters in Greene's novel. Think of Fowler. I mean, is Fowler a nice person? Not really. Just to give one other example.
Yeah, and maybe we'll come to Yuliya next.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would say that yes, definitely the whiskey priest is an anti-hero, and many characters that Jon mentioned are anti-heroes. And this is partly because Greene focuses on losers. Yeah? His main character is someone who is nasty, like Pinky. But then he's really interested in exploring the personality of this hero and seeing whether there is some potential even in such a person like Bendrix, who starts from hate and comes through love through the back door of hate. Or Pinky, a choir boy, a killer, who still has these remnants of the divine in himself, who still misses the mass. And the only way he can approach God is his recollections about the mass. But there is something good, this potential for faith in him as well. So I would say that Greene deliberately focuses on anti-hero to explore the heroic potential. And also another thing is that I think Greene is a thoroughly ironic writer, and he's especially interested in creating paradox and this tension between the hero and anti-hero, and seeing how it works out.
Yeah, which links to what one of our audience members has said. Fiona has commented that it reminds her of Harry Lime too, and this idea of a particular brand of morality. So that idea of a paradox, thinking about what is morality and what strands there are to it. Martyn, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with what both Jon and Yuliya said. I think Greene was a particularly mischievous writer. Now, it's obviously the case that the priest in the novel doesn't have many likable features by the end. We still, nevertheless, feel some commitment to the commitment he has shown against himself. He is obviously a flawed and paradoxical character who is damaged and wounded and fractured, and yet he is doggedly committed to presenting both to himself, even in his unconscious, and to the environment in which he is situated, a Catholic faith, a recognizably Catholic faith that has all the markers that we would associate with Catholicism then, which was part of what, of course, Greene was actively pursuing. And I also think there's a strong ethical dynamic to the paradoxes Greene continually pursued in every single novel, which is that the constant lacing and then untying of characters in their really difficult circumstances, whether it be Fowler's conflicted friendship and loyalties, or Bendrix's uptightness and indecision and dilemma about what to make of the question of God. There is in that a certain sense of regularity that means we still recognize that these characters are on a course, or as we might call it, a narrative towards something good, after the story is closed.
Thank you. John, were you going to come in there?
Sorry, can I just come back to you, Martyn, and in a sense also to Yuliya as well, that you're seeing some goodness in those people, and I appreciate what you said, but in the case of the priest, is I would play devil's advocate and say, you know, this dogged commitment, to use the phrase that you used, Martyn, is it dogged commitment or is it habit? Is it a habit of a lifetime that there's something inside of him which says, yes, I ought to act in a certain way, and so on? Is that a remnant of his what he's learnt and how he's learnt to act as a priest?
Yeah, I'll try and be briefer. I think it's a lovely feature of his character. I do think something that Greene was extremely good at was portraying characters who had real depth and solidity and sinuousness. Greene's characters were obviously well thought through and generated in such a way as one seems to be an echo of another, as seen in the Catholic cycle. But you know, to answer your question directly, and if I may allude to my book, I think Greene also explores, to some measure with an authentic knowledge, the idea of theological aesthetics, the idea that one's theology is built into one's character in such a way that even though there is the principle of habit keeping a certain religious current going, that is still built intimately into other features of religious language, including, for example, the both mystical substitution and also the mystique of sin, the idea that sin has a worthy quality to it sometimes.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your responses to my question. That was so illuminating. So we have a couple of questions in from the audience. So I'm going to start with one by Henry. Henry writes, thanks, everyone, for your fantastic talks. My question is to everyone. Is there any possibility of assigning a definition to the character of Greene's religion or Catholicism? I've read critics before that have labelled Greene as an existential Catholic. How convincing do you find this? John, go ahead.
Well, no, I wouldn't even know where to begin as far as trying to put a label on his Catholicism, which was always very unconventional. I mean, Greene ended up by calling himself a Catholic agnostic. And that was right very, very late on in his life, and that was the only place where I think he, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the only place where he ever gave any kind of definition to his form of Catholicism. I don't understand what he wrote. In fact, he did write a little bit about it. And I read it through and I still didn't understand it. So I'm not much help. But perhaps Martyn has a view on that.
Yeah, I do.
Label.
Yeah. So Greene used a number of labels. To John Mortimer, he called himself a Catholic agnostic. To V.S. Pritchett, he called himself a Catholic atheist. To John Cornwell, he called himself an uninstructed Catholic. He said to Martin Amis, we are all unbelievers in our own faiths, which was a reference to communism in the 1980s. So, and all of these comments are made off the cuff, it seems, in the course of the interviews. They're just thrown in. And I do wonder whether Greene was trying to sometimes tie his interviewers up in knots, if not his readership, and just be continually perplexing. It seemed he doesn't want any label fixed to him, and those terms would suggest that.
Yeah, I think that's a very good answer. I mean, he's, as I said at the beginning when I talked, he's a mass of contradictions. The more you look at his life, the more you realise that he'll say one thing one time and then something completely different the other. And I think you're right. I think you sum it out very well, that he has this kind of spontaneity to questions, and that is where the ultimate barrier is, because you know, you can't really penetrate to what he entirely believes. And is he consistent in his beliefs as well? I put that as a question. So very, very complex character. And I think on this question of religion, which was on the heart of his life for so many years, he is very, very evasive.
I wonder, thank you, if I could bring Yuliya in, because also I know what I really enjoyed about, well, lots of things about your talk, but how you were talking about Greene's vision, and how he might have a vision of in this novel, and that kind of ambition of him to declare a certain perspective, maybe. What do you think?
Oh, I think Martyn and Jon gave very good answers, which tackle a very difficult question. Another way to approach this, I think, would be to look on Greene's works in total. He wrote for almost 50 years, more than 20 novels, a lot of works. And he was very Brickean in how he approached fiction and what he wrote about. I think the things to remember would be that he was eclectic, and he was also quite instrumental in his approach. So in his Catholic cycle, he dipped into Catholicism, and he founded the images and situations that he wanted to use to express his own perception of faith and of the human condition. But then by the time he wrote Burnt Out Case, Catholicism no longer inspired him. So he moved on to something else, arguably existentialism. So I think, as with every doctrine that he encountered, Greene was very selective in how he approached Catholicism, and also eclectic. So you can't really put a single label on him. And with regard to this term existential Catholic, I would say that he was a Catholic, and he was existentialist as well.
Thank you. Well, that was a really intriguing question. And now let's turn to our second audience question from Martyn, who has said, "Thank you for your talks, really interesting. I have some naive questions. I don't think they're naive questions, but I'll put them to you as a panel. How would you describe Greene's style? Where does Greene fit in the 1930s, 40s? Is there more doubt than faith in Greene? How Catholic is Greene's Catholicism?" So building on from that. And what literary influences are at work on or Greene? What do you think is the best scene in the novel? So there's loads there. So maybe each of you might want to pick one that you might want to respond to that stands out to you. Maybe we'll come to Martyn this time.
How would you describe Greene's style? Lovely question. The reason being, okay, so to answer the question, I would describe Greene's style as often written in a regular vernacular. People get quite confused when they hear him speak. They expect to hear someone who's working class or has a rather demotic vocabulary or voice, but actually he was extremely erudite. He was firmly middle class, very well read, from a long tradition of learned persons. With a cousin was Robert Louis Stevenson. You know, there is a huge history there, and similarly, his style is extremely careful, measured, I would say it doesn't try to do anything too flamboyant. I think Greene's writing is served more by his characters than his language, and I think characterization is mostly where his emphasis is. There is really there's not that much out there on his style, and it's probably something that could be written upon more.
Thank you. Well, that's very intriguing in terms of a gap in Greene scholarship potentially. Jonathan, Jon.
Well, yeah, I'm picking up on that question. Certainly, Greene, there is more doubt, I think, than faith in Greene. I think that the obvious high point, if you like, of his engagement and with religion came in those four Catholic novels that have been mentioned already. But before those, I mean, I gave the instance of A Gun for Sale, and somebody recently heard a talk where somebody had traced some of the origins of him writing about religion in his very earliest writings, and it goes through right beyond the 1930s and 40s. But throughout all of that, there is certainly the doubt. I mean, the doubt there, the doubting Thomas of the apostle who wanted to actually have the visible proof of the wounds that Christ had from being on the cross. There is that, I think, throughout his writing. I mean, taking the last book, which has a very strong Catholic theme or religious theme in it, Monsignor Quixote. If people have actually read that book, you've got the Monsignor himself, and you've got the communist mayor. And in many ways, if you read that book, I think he sees more of the point from the point of view of the communist mayor than he does from Quixote. Quixote, a bit of a tired old priest, is an interesting character, but he somehow is outdone by the character of the communist mayor. So I would say to the questioner, far more doubt in than faith in Greene. He hated that being dubbed a Catholic writer. He said, writer who happened to be a Catholic, and I think that, and also the doubting Catholic, I think, as well.
Thanks, Jon. Yuliya, do you want to answer any of those questions?
I'd like to think about the literary influences on Greene, and this is a very interesting topic because Greene was changing as he progressed in his career. In his early works, he was influenced by Joseph Conrad, and he found that influence inhibiting. And he vowed never to read Conrad, but then his diaries show that as he was writing a burnt out case, he came back to rereading Conrad because obviously there were very strong resonances that he found in Conrad. So Conrad was a major influence. And in his early works, he was also interested in modernist writers. For example, Eliot's Wasteland comes up in his early novels, and Ford Madox Fox, I think, was also another major influence. And Greene was happy when the senior writer endorsed his novel It's a Battlefield. So in his early works, Greene experimented with modernist techniques, with stream of consciousness, with a divided self, with some techniques reminiscent of literary impressionism. For example, in his first novel, The Man Within. But then he moved on, and his next system of ideas that fascinated him was Catholic theology. And I think there are interesting parallels between Greene and Francois Mauriac, which could be explored further. And then in 1950s, I'm thinking about the comedians. I would say that he became interested in existentialist philosophy, probably because he was living in France at the time, and Sartre and Camus were very much in the spotlight in this period. So I would say that he was reacting to and creatively reworking Sartre's and Camus' concepts of existentialist absurd and Camus' notion of revolt. And also, if you look at Greene's work in their totality, I would say that apart from Joseph Conrad, Miguel de Unamuno, the existentialist writer, was another major influence. But Greene is so diverse and so voracious in his literary appetites. So it's difficult really to trace any significant influence that stayed with him. But I would probably say that Joseph Conrad and Miguel de Unamuno are those that followed him in his literary career. And this is also shown by his last, one of his last novels, Monsignor Quixote, which enters into dialogue with Unamuno's work about Don Quixote.
I'm so interested in literary influence, and I didn't know about that link to Conrad, so thank you. John, you were going to...
Yeah, I was just going to say that with Joseph Conrad, I mean, you're quite right about Joseph Conrad, but of course, Greene sought to deliberately to expunge the Joseph Conrad influence in his writing, and that's why we got the two suppressed novels, The Name of Action and Rumour at Nightfall, which Greene really sort of, in a sense, disowned and never allowed to be republished because he felt that he was imitating too much of Conrad's style.
And you know, the existentialist current that runs throughout Greene's work went through various forms. There is, of course, the sense of enemy that Conrad explored at length. Miguel Unamuno is a Jesuit writer that Greene was deeply committed to, and that informed some of the conversations between the Monsignor Quixote and the communist mayor. But of course, one of the themes of existentialism as a movement was the idea of lived experience, that is phenomenology. And Greene, I think, was in multiple respects a writer and reader who is intimately connected to diverse aspects of each decade he wrote in. If you read Richard Greene's recent wonderful biography on the life and times of Greene, you see Greene sometimes absolutely vigorously inserting himself into the daily life of communities or political movements, and that is reflected in a variety of ways in each of his novels, whether it be the politics of Haiti and the comedians or the wonderfully prescient The Quiet American.
Might I bring in another audience question at this point? Greene uses Catholic terminology in the title of The Power and the Glory, unlike his other Catholic novels, except perhaps Monsignor Quixote. Would you comment?
Yeah, so The Power and the Glory is, in very simplistic terms, it can be seen as the power of the Mexican state, the glory of the priest, and what he represents. I think that's far too simplistic, and I don't find it helpful, to be honest. because one thing Greene did very well was to continually juggle binaries and make sure they never are firmly opposed. Greene was always winding his way throughout different, both in the complexity of his plots and the density of his characters. He was very keen to make sure that there was a certain parity between competing doctrines. And as we see in this novel, which was written according to a thesis, the lieutenant who seeks to limit life, the priest who continues to pass life on in his drunken state. Now, obviously, the power and the glory is also repeated in churches up and down the country every Sunday in the course of the liturgy. I'm not entirely sure. It almost certainly would have been used then in some capacity, even if in common parlance. I think one thing Greene did quite well was to use the lowest common denominator in his titles in order to use us, so that would serve as a springboard to more and more discussion. And we see this in his non-fiction and his fiction, Ways of Escape, The Last Word. Even Marie-Francois Allen's book Interview, The Other Man, it seems to me that the characters Greene portrays and explores so richly in his novels are echoes of a greater character, which is the need to make a statement as a writer who was intent on having an impact on the modern world, and who at the end of the day was middlebrow, who sought to attract a popular audience, but who also always sought to leave a small gap open to allow something else in, Ways of Escape. Let's take the first volume of autobiography. A Sort of Life is, of course, both, a mixing up of all the themes that have dominated his life until the point in which he was writing, which was 1971. But there's also a sense in which Greene doesn't take himself too seriously. It's just a sort of life. And indeed, I think in his titles, he doesn't seek to be too flamboyant or, too ostentatious. I think he sought to appeal to everyone as far as he could.
Thanks, Martyn. And thank you for coming straight back to you. It was just such a specific question about that Catholic terminology. I just thought it was so relevant. We are coming towards the end of our time, but I just wanted to throw that out there to Jon and Yuliya, the question of the title. Do you have any thoughts on that, the title of the novel?
Well, I mean, the only thing that strikes me immediately was that it's not a specifically Catholic terminology to the power and the glory. It's in the Lord's Prayer. And the Catholic Church used to give, in fact, a shortened version of what is commonly, which is now used in Catholic churches as the Lord's Prayer, which included the power and the glory at the end of it. So it's not specifically Catholic terminology to use that. Just to be specific about it, but no. All I would say is an interesting thought. There are others which sort of hint. I mean, the heart of the matter. I mean, it's not specifically Catholic or Christian terminology, but in a sense, it seems to me to be a title which is part of the, part of a debate, a religious debate where you might talk about things which are important in life, meaning of life, and so on. So the heart of the matter is perhaps has that hint in it there as well.
There are a couple of things that I would like to add. First, that Greene was very active participant in the literary market. He knew how to market his books, and his titles were an important part of this marketing. So I think many of his titles, as Martyn said, are aimed at the common denominator, but also they're interesting titles, and they were meant to attract the publisher's attention. And it's known that one of his texts was accepted on the strength of the title and the first scene, The Third Man, because it was such an interesting and topical concept at the time. And another thing I was thinking about is that if we look at the titles in Jeunesse terms, this would be the paratext, which would be one of the few places where the author would draw the reader's attention towards a desirable interpretation. So if we follow this path, we can say in The Power and the Glory, Greene wanted to draw the reader's attention towards this Catholic strain in the text. But in his other Catholic novels, he focused more on the human, the end of the affair, the heart of the matter. And I would say this is symptomatic of Greene, because I think when he juxtaposes the divine and the human, it's always the human that he's more interested in.
You. Wow. Well, I have so many more questions just me, so I'm sure the audience do as well. That was kind of about Jon's work in manuscripts and thinking about the pace of this novel within the Catholic set of novels. Anyway, but we must stop because we've come to the end of our time. So I just want to invite the audience to give a virtual round of applause to our three wonderful speakers for this evening. And thank you so much for joining us, to our audience. I really hope you enjoyed it. So as we say, thanks to our speakers for tonight, I'm just going to finish by letting you know about our next Cardiff Book Talk event is. So yeah, I can see people in the chat saying that was brilliant. Thank you for your compliments. So we continue our online series of events for this academic year, and actually our next event for Cardiff Book Talk is coming up quite soon on the 8th of December. This event is held at an earlier time of 12 p.m. midday. It will not be recorded, so make sure you're there for the live show. We are considering the recent film The Green Knight, directed by David Lowery and starring Dev Patel, alongside its source text, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, a late 14th century Middle English chivalric romance by an unknown author. So if you want to join us next time, go to cardiffbooktalk.org to book your free ticket. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to our three fantastic speakers, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.